Morning folks, Kevin here. Well, it's July 11th, 2018, and about a week ago I posted a video showing that we're putting the bird netting over the blueberry bushes. Basically cleaning out, doing the weeding around the perimeter, removing a lot of the encroaching weeds that are working their way up over the wood chips that are alongside of the weed mat, and cleaning the area up and getting the bird netting over the polytunnel hoops that I made here in the past. And after posting that video, muscadines and more asked some really good questions. Number one, how are you watering and fertilizing these plants? And more importantly, what about when these plants are 5-6 feet tall? With this weed matting, that poses problems as far as, geez, how long will the weed mat last? How am I getting water to them and all, and how are we fertilizing them? Well, over the last couple years, our droughts have been, just standard droughts, not really too bad at all. The problem is that this area, I use basically like a back to Eden approach initially. I was able to get a very large pile of wood chips, multiple loads probably. It took me a couple of months of hauling every day with my dump trailer, loads of wood chips. And this whole area all around here, I laid wood chips out on top of the gravel that was here. Now, as you know, the gravel is really porous, and so water runs right through the surface of it. It has, without the organic material there, it really doesn't have a lot of fertilizing ability as well. But I wanted to get started with the food forest, and then we did some subsequent sheet mulching with cardboard, more wood chips, so it's been done several times, using compost in the area as well. Well, I've worked at trying to grow blueberries for a few years. Now we have lots of these larger blueberry bushes that you could see potentially around that are 6 foot tall anyways. And they're ones that were growing natively around here on the property. So I knew that the blueberries had conditions that were conducive to them developing even in our native soils, which were pretty poor soils. So that was one thought that I had. I bought a whole bunch of small blueberry plants, basically just cuttings that had roots on them. And unfortunately, because of the vegetative growth on the weeds, in other words, all of the quack grasses and bindweed and all of those plants that weren't desirable, they engulfed all of those small blueberry bushes, and that was a failure. So then I bought some small blueberry bushes that were probably 14 to 18 inches tall from the top of the pot to the top of the plant, and I planted those. And I initially planted those around the house and outside of the dog run, which I mentioned before, and then I messed that up by putting spearmint around them, and that overtook the blueberry bushes. Then I bought another batch and planted them out here. What I did to prep this area was I did use a rototiller to try and get all the boulders out of the area, and that really dropped the soil level down quite a bit. And it was pretty poor soil, and since I had disrupted the soil and there was quackgrass and other problems, I knew I needed to use weed mat at that time. And when I first put them in, I put a soaker hose around the base of it. And I'll show you in a minute in another area where I'm putting soaker hose down now. So the first year I used a soaker hose underneath the weed mat to water the plants. They took root pretty darn well, and they grew up, but I had problems with the white-tailed deer coming in and other little herbivores as well, and harvesting, and certainly the birds taking the blueberries. So I put the hoops there, and this year I put the bird netting over it. And so we've been really successful as far as harvesting the blueberries since putting the bird netting on there. Thea's been able to harvest them every couple of days when she has time off. And that's worked out pretty well. Now this season we're having another drought, so I did hook up a hose, but for the last couple years I really haven't watered these plants at all. And I think that they would be much more lush and larger had they not been browsed on, but because of my negligence I just didn't have them covered appropriately. And I just bought this bird netting either over the winter time or early in the spring, I can't remember when. So that's where we are right here right now. I'm going to take you over to the other location where we had some of our blueberry transplants. Actually, it just dawned on me, I probably should show you. So the blueberries under the hoops are right behind me right here. I'm just going to turn around, face the food forest in the other direction. The lighting's a little worse, but this is a blueberry bush right behind me. This is one of the native ones. Now the grasses and the weeds grow up in between it, and it's a hassle me getting them out. But ultimately I'm going to be putting a perennial ground cover, try to get that to take root underneath all of these. These blueberries, we have multiple different ones because they're all brought in by the various birds around, so there are different combinations of blueberries. Some are very, very almost black colored, loaded with anthocyanins, but most of the blueberries are much smaller than the commercial ones, that like the Patriot, the Northland blueberries, the Blue Crop, Blue Gold, Elliott, all of those that I have grown here on site as well. But before going back there, Jesus, if I'm walking by some of these blueberry plants, you could get an idea of some of the blueberry plants around here. So there's a couple of rows that I've got of the blueberry plants. It might be a little bit difficult to detect just what they are because the birds are taking all the blueberries off of these plants at this time as well. Okay, so I'm over here in an area that I've shown in a couple of videos. One, when I first put these plants over here, these were originally blueberry plants that were planted around the house, around the dog run around the house. They grew beautifully initially, produced lots and lots of berries, were taller than what they are now. But some of the plants I had planted spearmint around them, big mistake. It decreased photosynthesis because the spearmint took off like crazy and grew very tall as the blueberry plants, competed for nutrients, competed for solar exposure, decreased airflow through the plants, decreased pollination. So it was a bad combination, not a good companion relationship. There wasn't the mutualism that I was looking for, where both species would be benefited from each other. And that's one of the examples of where I learned that although I want perennial ground covers, I have to make sure that they're actually a ground cover and they're not a perennial bush or a perennial herb that's going to be very tall. So ultimately, in order to manage the blueberry plants when they're 5 or 6 feet tall, I want to be able to have ground cover as well as some bushes as well that are all perennial or self-seeding annuals that'll have bring in the beneficial insects to take care of the predators, to be plants that will draw in the predators as well and keep them off the blueberry plants. To create nitrogen-rich soil, so we have nitrogen fixers there as well as dynamic accumulators. So having the ideal or at least optimal companion planting species that are perennial or self-seeding annuals all around these perennial bushes that I'm going to be harvesting in the future. These blueberry plants will be used for cuttings in the future, and these ones will probably get transplanted into a location of the deeper hugelkultur combination back to Eden systems that I've described in previous videos, like the hugelkultur terrace and all. Places where I've been putting in compost, but well, started off by burying logs, using lots of wood chips, lots of brush and all. In other words, building deep, rich soil below where the plants are going to be planted so they can really send down deep roots and all. The other thing is that I've got to inoculate all of the surface area so that I can get more of the microbiome that's optimal for each one of these species. And I'm still working that out at this point, really paying close attention to the what I'm going to call self-seeded, but really the birds brought in the seeds for all the perennial bushes here, and really using the soil that's at the base of these plants, inoculating the wood chips and the materials that I'm putting at the base of those plants as well. So ultimately in the future, we won't have the need for irrigation or fertilization, because the relationship, the mutualistic symbiotic relationship between the plant species beneath the blueberry bushes, and that will be a perennial ground cover admixed with some annual self-seeding flowering plants, some dynamic accumulators that are perennial plants, some nitrogen fixers that are perennial plants, that are going to bring in beneficial insects, be a food source for pollinators as well. And so we can have a dynamic natural interaction between all the plant species. So there's no need for me to water. There's no need for me to fertilize in the future as well. And I can use those plants as a source for cuttings to start more plants in the future. So that's my ultimate goal. But in the urge to get things started a few years ago, when I saw that my rooted cuttings really were being overtaken, I knew I needed to go with bigger plants. But I then ran into deer browse issues, the bird harvesting the berries and all, and we do have the droughts around here as well. So that really made me, instead of preparing for irrigation, my long-term goal is to create an environment where irrigation is no longer necessary. Now I may fail with this, I just don't know yet, but that's my goal, really observing and seeing how well the native species or the bird seeded systems have worked, trying to mimic what's actually going on this property and trying to enhance all of those qualities. For right now, what I'm doing today, the other day I came in and chopped down all the spearmint and the other weeds around here, cleaned up all the pots from the nursery that the deer had consumed the plants with, got those out of here, weeded, or at least got rid of a lot of the many of the spearmint that was above the ground, chopped it right down, did the best that I could. And eventually I'll be pulling those plants out of this side over here where all the spearmint roots are in when they go dormant at the end of the season, maybe this year, maybe not, and try to pull out all the roots again and go bare root with these, prune these back, and see if I can get them come back without the spearmint. But for now, my goal is, since we're in another drought and the soil hasn't been built up adequately here yet, I'm using soaker hose at the base of these plants. I'm just testing it out right now to see if it's going. I'm taking some of my old soaker hose, hooking up lines. Now I'm going to put a timer on it. And then I'm going to take some of my used weed mat and cover up, so at least I decrease the tremendous volume of the spearmint, because that stuff just, it's amazing how well that stuff grows. And so I can knock down some of the spearmint so it isn't going to be as overwhelming for the blueberry plants that are there. And see how that does over this next year or so. I'll put the bird netting back up over the galvanized electrical conduit hoops that I put here. Sorry about the sweating. And so that's my goal at this point. So long term, more of a natural food forest adaptation of a U-pick blueberry organic orchard on a combination of a hugelkultur, back to Eden, lots and lots of wood chips, lots of trees and brush buried, and then taking inoculations from the plants that are more successful. So those ones in our forest area where the blueberry plants are doing so well, inoculating all of that, the wood chips and the materials on the surface, with the hopes of creating an optimal environment for all those perennial ground covers, bushes, annual self-seeding plants, dynamic accumulators, nitrogen fixers, and all that, to decrease the workload of me in the future, and all. So I hope that this answers that question somewhat adequately. I'm not there yet, but with some time and effort, I may be successful. We'll see. So thanks so much, Muscadines and more. I hope that's your name. For the questions. I appreciate it. And I'm going to try and do more of these Ask Me Anything videos as soon as I can. Just been a little bit overwhelmed lately. Thanks so much for watching, folks. I really appreciate it. If you have comments or questions, leave them below. Share it with your friends. Hit the bell icon if you want to be notified when we post more videos. And by all means, have a fantastic day. Bye-bye now.